In this video, we are going to dive deep into Riverpod. We will learn about all the essential components of Riverpod, limitations we get while using it, and solutions to them. One of the solutions I've covered is the next big thing in the Riverpod world. So make sure to watch the video till the end to know more about it. Started, head to pubspec.yaml file and make sure you have the latest version of Flutter Riverpod installed. Riverpod is divided into three packages: Hooks Riverpod, Flutter Riverpod, and Riverpod. Hooks Riverpod is used with Flutter hooks, Flutter Riverpod with the Flutter SDK, and the Riverpod with Dart programs. That means you can create CLIs using Riverpod. After having that in place, go to the main.dart file, wrap your root widget, the widget that's passed in the run app, with a widget known as provider scope. This provider scope widget is a constant and it comes from Flutter Riverpod package. This provider scope keeps track of all the providers and ensures that there's no leakage of state in spite of the providers being declared globally. Global declaration of providers or variables in general means if suppose I have a variable like string name and I've declared it outside of any function and outside of any class, I've declared it globally. Usually, global declaration, be it of variables or providers, should be a problem because of mutability issues. Meaning, if a non-constant variable like this name is declared, its value can be changed by any function. For example, if I have the main function right here, I can change the value of name over here, right? So I can type my name as Rivan over here. And I can do the same thing in home screen. Here I can just import main.dart file and set it to none. Imagine this for hundreds and thousands of files. Do you think it's a good practice to do this? It's not, because it would be very difficult to know which function changed the value of name and if we ever want it or not, and to find it will be a big task and we generally don't want to do that. So you might think, if this is prohibited, why does provider or Riverpod even do this? The reason for that is the providers declared globally in Riverpod are immutable, and this is for all the providers in Riverpod. They all are immutable except one, which we will talk about in a while. Now let's just remove this line and get to the first type of provider, which is provider itself. Riverpod has multiple providers which can give us access to state, whatever state we want to access, and for them each provider has its own purpose. So the very first type of provider is provider. It is called provider. If you're coming from provider package, you already know about it. As the name suggests, it is an object that provides data to widgets or other providers. It is a read-only widget and cannot update the value inside of it. It can be used to provide primitive, non-primitive data types and even instances of classes. To create a provider, what we do, and this follows for all the type of providers, not just for provider, we put a final because the value cannot be changed, and then we give the name of the type of the provider. So I'm just going to provide name provider, and I always like to suffix it with the provider, because suppose if I have this class right here and I've named this provider as name, and here I'm using an instance variable of the data type string, so I have string name over here, I'll get pretty confused, right? If I want to access this name provider or the name variable that I've created over here. That's why I like to suffix it with provider so that there's a clear distinction. Then is equal to and then the type of the provider. The very first type of our provider is provider itself. So we have provider, and here we will just create a function. But you can see it gives us an error. The reason for that is this function gives us access to something known as ref, which is provider ref. This provider ref will allow us to talk with other providers. We'll take an example for that later on, but for now, all you need to know is that provider refs will allow us to talk with other providers. Now if you hover over this, you can see it is of the type provider null. But that's not what I want. I don't want to return null. If you don't pass anything, what this is doing is basically returning null like this. And that's why the data type over here is null. However, I want to return the name. So I'm just going to have Rivan returned over here. And now if you hover over this, it's of the type string. It automatically detects the type that you are returning. However, if you want, you can just add a data type over here. So you can just write string over here, and that works too. But if you pass an int over here and return a string, it will throw an error for you. So you have to change it either over here or just convert it back to string. If you have int, you'll return 2 like this. And a shorter syntax to return from this is, since this is a function, we'll just create an arrow function. So we'll just have something like this done. Since this is a function, we have an arrow function right here. But since I'm returning a name, I'm just going to create something like this now. Now what I want to do is, whatever name I've returned over here, I want to display it in this screen. So it's in a separate file itself. I don't have the name property over here. I don't have access to name provider over here. I have access to it in a different file. So how am I going to do that? Well, for that we have the reading properties. There are two ways to read a provider in any file. So since this provider is globally declared, you can read it in any file that you want and it will work for you. So if you want to read it in the home screen, there are two ways of doing it. First one is using a consumer widget over here. This consumer widget is given by the Flutter Riverpod package. So you just need to remove the stateless part and add consumer. So you have consumer widget. And then here you can see we are getting the error. To fix it, just put in a comma and have widget ref. This widget ref is similar to the provider ref that we had over here. Only difference between these two is widget ref allows you to communicate from widgets to other providers. That's what we are going to do. We are going to make use of this ref so that we can call the provider because we are in a widget, right? So from this widget, we are going to contact this provider. However, this ref will allow you to communicate from one provider to other provider, obviously. So that is the difference between widget ref and provider ref. Now to display the value, what can you do? Well, you can have final name is equal to. Now you just want to extract the data given from this provider. How will you do that? Well, again, there are multiple methods for this. I'm going to show you the three methods. First one is ref.watch. You want to pass in the name of the provider. Our provider is name provider. So we have that. So what we are doing is watching the name provider and you have access to name, and you can see it infers it that it's of the type string. We have nowhere mentioned it is string, but since our provider has already decided that this is of the type string, it knows, yeah, whatever provider we are listening is of the type string, which is pretty cool. We always need to have data types for our variables. Now we can just take this name property and have it over here. Also remove the constant because we are watching it from a provider. Now we can restart the entire application, and here you can see Rivan Ranawat shows up. If you change the value here, for example something like this doesn't get updated because changes on hot reload, example when we just click Ctrl S in provider, is not supported in Flutter Riverpod package. So you just need to restart the entire app, and after you do that, you get access to Rivan.